my phone buzzed, displaying a name I hadn't seen in a decade. Uncle Frank. The patriarch of the Vance clan, the one who'd laughed me out of Detroit. "Leo," he grunted, the desperation in his voice barely masking the old contempt. "Sterling Automotive is planning cuts. Big ones. Your father, your cousins, they're on the list. We need your help." I leaned back in my leather chair, the skyline sprawling below me. This was the same man who told my father I was too soft to lead a pack of dogs, let alone a factory line. "My help?" I asked, letting the silence hang. "Frank, you're calling the National Union office. I'm just the man who runs it. Tell me about the problem." Frank's voice crackled, listing names that felt like ghosts. My father, Mark Vance, a man whose silence was a weapon, always nodding in agreement as Frank held court. Then my cousins, Rick and Dale. I could still feel the phantom shoved from them in the factory break room, their laughter echoing. "This place needs calluses, Leo, not paper cuts." Rick had sneered, mocking the law books I carried. They were the reason I left Detroit, the living embodiment of the notion that my ambition was a weakness. Now Frank was practically pleading. "They're gutting the line, Leo. A 40% cut. They're blaming automation, but we know it's just corporate greed." I pictured them all, the swagger gone. The hard men of Sterling Automotive, suddenly fragile. The irony was so thick, I could taste it. They had built their identities on being tough, on being survivors. Yet, at the first sign of a real storm, they called the nephew they'd cast out. "I see," I said, my voice a flat line. "And what has the local chapter done so far?" The silence on his end was the only answer I needed. They had done nothing. They had simply called me. After the call, I didn't move. I just stared at the city lights, but all I could see was the grease-stained floor of the Sterling Automotive break room 20 years ago. I was 24, working the line by day and putting myself through law school at night. I was exhausted, but I was also full of ideas. I'd spent a month charting inefficiencies, mapping out a simple workflow change that could reduce repetitive strain injuries on the line by 10% and increase output by 3%. I typed it up, made copies, and brought it to the informal weekly meeting run by my uncle. I can still feel the weight of that binder in my hands. I stood there, my voice earnest, explaining the data. My cousins, Rick and Dale, were snickering in the corner before I'd even finished my first sentence. When I was done, a heavy silence filled the room. All eyes went to Frank. He picked up my report with 2 fingers, as if it were something dirty, and let it drop onto a table slick with coffee rings. He didn't look at me. He looked at everyone else. "We build cars here," he announced, his voice booming. "We don't write book reports." Laughter erupted, raw and cruel. Rick stepped forward and jabbed a thumb at my chest. "This place needs calluses, Leo, not paper cuts from your fancy binders." He shoved me, not hard, but enough to make me stumble back. It was a dismissal, a final shove out of their world. Through it all, I looked for one person. My father. He stood by the door, his arms crossed, his face a mask of weary neutrality. He saw the laughter, the shove, the humiliation his son was enduring. I looked right at him, my eyes pleading for a single word, a nod, anything. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Then he looked down at his steel-toed boots. That was his answer. His silence wasn't a weapon that day. It was a verdict. It told me I was alone. It told me I didn't belong. That was the day I stopped trying to fix a single assembly line and decided to learn how to challenge the entire system. I packed my bags a week later. They all thought I was running away because I was too soft. They were wrong. I wasn't running from a fight. I was leaving to find a bigger one, a battleground where their rules didn't apply and my kind of strength, the kind that came from books and strategy, not just brute force, could actually win. Now, After all these years, the war had finally come back to their front door, and they were asking me to be their general. The past was a ghost, but the present was a chessboard. I booked a flight for the next morning. I didn't go to the factory, a place full of memories I had no desire to revisit. Instead, I convened the meeting at the local union hall, in a sterile conference room that smelled of stale coffee and bureaucracy. My turf. They arrived together, a pack stripped of its swagger. Frank's shoulders were slumped. Rick and Dale looked like they'd aged a decade, their defiance replaced with a sullen anxiety. My father, Mark, was last, a shadow clinging to the doorframe, his eyes fixed on the floor. I let them wait for 10 minutes before I walked in, my leather briefcase clicking shut on the table with a sound that seemed to make them all flinch. I didn't offer a seat or a handshake. Sterling's proposal is a non-starter, I began, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. A 40% cut is not a negotiation. It's a declaration of war. Corporate has already priced in a standard union response. Some picketing, a few press releases, then capitulation. We're not going to give them that. I saw a flicker of hope in Frank's eyes. So what do we do, Leo? We don't fight their battle. We start our own, I said, opening my briefcase and pulling out a single folder. I didn't open it. I just rested my hand on it. Standard procedure is to file a grievance and wait. We're not doing that. We're going to create leverage where there is none. We're going to make the remaining 60% of the workforce so inefficient, so problematic, that keeping them will seem more expensive than keeping everyone. Rick leaned forward, the old sneer almost returning. What are you talking about? A strike? A strike is a sledgehammer, and we need a scalpel, I countered, my eyes locking onto his. I'm talking about a targeted, strategic slowdown. A. Work to rule. Action. You do your job exactly as it is written. No more, no less. No more of the little shortcuts and efficiencies you've all developed over the years to make the line run smoothly. We clogged their arteries from the inside. They looked at each other. The idea was seductive. It was defiance without immediate risk. It was their kind of fight. Subtle sabotage masked as compliance. This requires discipline, I continued, my voice low and firm. It requires leadership on the floor. Someone to organize it, to make sure everyone is on the same page. It can't come from the union officially. Not at first. It has to look like a spontaneous reaction from the workers themselves. It has to be led by someone they trust. Someone with grit. I let my gaze drift from Frank to Rick, then to Dale. I was dangling the one thing they understood: control. Frank puffed out his chest. We can do that. The men will listen to us. Good, I said, a thin smile on my lips. I need you to spearhead it. Starting Monday, I want you three to rally the key guys on the line. But you do it quietly. Word this wrong, and it's an illegal wildcat action. That's grounds for immediate termination with cause. No severance, no pension. You understand the risk? They nodded eagerly, missing the trap for the bait. They saw a chance to be heroes, the tough guys leading the charge. As they got up to leave, buzzing with a renewed sense of purpose, I finally looked at my father, who hadn't said a word. Dad. He flinched, his head snapping up. His eyes met mine for the first time in 10 years. They were filled with a desperate, pleading hope. I need you to keep a list, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. A list of everyone who participates. For our records. He nodded, a silent promise. They walked out, leaving me alone in the conference room. They thought I was giving them a weapon. I didn't wait in Detroit. I flew back to my office, to the silence and the skyline. The war room didn't need to be on the ground. It was wherever I was. For 3 days, I heard nothing. Then, my private line rang. It was my father. His voice was a hushed, nervous whisper, tinged with an awe I hadn't heard since I was a child. "Leo, it's working. Maybe too well. The line is a disaster. Production is down 30%. Management is furious, but they can't pin it on anyone. Everyone's just doing their job. Frank and the boys, they're walking around like kings." I looked at the spreadsheet on my monitor, a sea of data I'd pulled from Sterling's own public filings. "Are they documenting every safety check, Dad? Verifying every part's number against the manifest, no matter how small? Following every single regulation to the letter?" To the letter, he confirmed. Rick even refused to use a wrench because it had a hairline crack in the handle, cited the safety manual, shut down his station for an hour. He called it Vance Family Quality Control. A cold smile touched my lips. "Good," I said. "Keep updating your list." I disconnected the call before he could ask why. He was just a soldier following orders. An hour later, my other phone buzzed. A number I knew well. My contact inside Sterling's corporate headquarters. A man who owed me a very significant favor. "Vance," he said, his voice crisp. "We have a situation. A coordinated slowdown. We've got security footage. Audio from the break rooms. We know exactly who's leading it. Frank Vance, Rick Vance, Dale Vance. They've been holding court, practically signing their names to it. We have them dead to rights." I leaned back in my leather chair, watching a plane descend towards the city. "I imagine you do." "What do you want us to do?" he asked. "Standard procedure is to terminate the ringleaders immediately, make an example of them." "No," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "Don't fire them. Not yet. Let them think they're winning. Let them feel completely in control. I want them to dig the hole a little deeper." I hung up the phone. My father's list was a decoy, a test of his obedience. I never needed it. I had let Frank, Rick, and Dale walk right into a cage of their own making. They thought their grit was their weapon. They were wrong. It was their confession. The calluses they were so proud of were leaving fingerprints all over the scene of the crime, and I was the only one who could see the verdict was already in. For another week, I let the poison work its way through Sterling's system. The calls from my father became a daily ritual. Each one was a status report delivered with a mix of fear and exhilaration. Production was in a freefall. A backlog of orders was piling up like a multi-car wreck. Management was holding frantic closed-door meetings. And on the factory floor, my uncle and cousins were basking in the glory of their rebellion, their laughter once again echoing in the break room, not with cruelty, but with the hollow confidence of men who thought they were winning a war, unaware it was a simulation. They were heroes, legends in their own minds. They didn't see the cameras documenting their every boastful speech. They didn't know the handheld radios they used to coordinate the slowdown were feeding every word to a server in a corporate office miles away. They were too busy enjoying the taste of power to notice the bitter aftertaste of the bait. Then, the call I was truly waiting for came. Not from a frantic union rep or a nervous father, but from a private number. Julian Croft, Sterling Automotive's CEO. "Mr. Vance," he said, the sound of his voice tight, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. "We need to talk. This situation, it's untenable." "I agree, Mr. Croft," I replied, my tone placid. "That's why I'm flying in tomorrow. My office will send you the time and location." I hung up before he could object. I wasn't coming to him. He was coming to me. I chose the same sterile conference room at the Union Hall. I wanted him on my turf, but not so far from the factory that he could forget the source of his problem. He arrived with a team of 2 lawyers, all of them carrying briefcases that seemed to weigh them down. I was alone. I had my briefcase, but I left it closed on the table. Croft dispensed with pleasantries. "Your people are waging an illegal war on my company." "My people," I said, letting the words hang in the air, "are following their job descriptions to the letter. If doing the job you've outlined for them brings this company to its knees, then perhaps the problem isn't with the workers, but with the work itself." One of the lawyers started to speak. But Croft waved him into silence. "We know who's leading this. Frank Vance and his 2 sons. We have enough to terminate them with cause and sue them for damages." "You could," I agreed, nodding slowly. "And the moment you do, this unofficial, contained slowdown becomes a national, official strike. Your illegal termination of union members will be the spark, but your plan to gut 40% of the workforce will be the fuel. We'll have picket lines in 3 states by the end of the week. Your brand will be synonymous with union busting. Your investors will love that." Croft's jaw tightened. He knew I was right. We stared at each other across the polished table. He had a dagger, but I had a guillotine. "What do you want, Vance?" he finally asked, the fight draining from his voice. I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the table. "First, the 40% cut is dead. It never existed. You will issue a public statement guaranteeing all current jobs for the next 5 years, tied to a new productivity agreement." "Productivity?" Croft scoffed. "You've just spent 2 weeks sabotaging it." "I'm not done," I said, my voice dropping. "Second, we are establishing a new joint oversight committee for process and safety, co-chaired. One from management, one from the union. It will have binding authority to review and mandate changes to assembly line procedures. We're going to fix the problems your bookkeepers have been ignoring for years. We're going to make this plant efficient, but we're going to do it by making it safer and smarter, not by bleeding the workforce." I saw the ghost of my 24-year-old self holding that binder. This was his vindication. Croft was pale. He was losing, and he knew it. But a cornered animal always bites back. "And the ringleaders?" he demanded. "I can't let them walk. I need a win here, Vance. I need their heads." This was the moment. The entire game hinged on this move. "I agree," I said softly. The room went silent. Croft and his lawyers stared at me, dumbfounded. "In unsanctioned, illegal action that puts the union and the company at risk cannot be tolerated," I continued, my voice cold and clear. "Leadership has consequences." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the file from my corporate contact. I didn't slide the whole thing over. Just 3 pages. The top sheets from the surveillance reports on Frank, Rick, and Dale. Transcripts of their boasts. Timestamps of their instructions to other workers. An organizational chart of the slowdown they had so proudly constructed. "These 3 men acted alone," I said, my voice like ice. "They endangered the jobs of every single person in that plant for their own egos. The National Union does not and will not protect them. Their termination is an internal disciplinary matter for Sterling Automotive. You have our blessing." Croft looked at the pages, then at me, a slow, dawning realization in his eyes. He thought he was getting a concession. He didn't understand he was simply a tool for my real objective. "And the new union co-chair of this committee?" he asked, his voice now cautious, respectful. "Who do you have in mind?" I let the question hang for a beat. "Someone with 30 years on that line. Someone who knows every bolt and every belt. A man who has never sought the spotlight, but who understands the value of quiet, consistent work. Mark Vance." After they left, accepting every term, I sat alone in the quiet room. I took out my phone and dialed the number I knew by heart. My father answered on the first ring, his voice anxious. "Leo, any news?" "The deal is done," I said, my voice flat, betraying nothing. "The layoffs are canceled. All jobs are secure." A wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed through the phone. "Oh, thank God, Leo, you did it. Frank and the boys, they're not going to believe it. They'll be—" I cut him off. "Frank, Rick, and Dale are being terminated. Effective immediately, for cause." The silence that followed was heavier than any I had ever heard from him. It wasn't a weapon or a verdict. It was. The silence on the line stretched, thick with the weight of unspoken history. It was the sound of a foundation cracking. Finally, a single, choked word came through the receiver. "Why?" It was my father. His voice was hollow, stripped of the awe it held just moments before. "Because leadership has consequences," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "They gambled with everyone's livelihood for a taste of power. They were reckless, and they were caught. They made themselves the perfect sacrifice, a sacrifice that saved every other job in that plant." More silence. I could picture him, standing in his small kitchen, the phone pressed hard against his ear, the world tilting on its axis. "There's something else," I continued, not giving him time to process. "The deal includes a new joint oversight committee. It has real power to change how the line is run. The union co-chair needs to be someone respected, someone who knows the job inside and out." I paused. "They ratified my nomination. Congratulations, Dad. Your first meeting is Thursday." I ended the call before he could respond. The shock was a tool, and I needed it to do its work. An hour later, I was in a rental car, driving through the familiar, faded streets of my old neighborhood. There was only one place they would all be: my father's house, the clan's unofficial headquarters. I parked across the street and watched the house for a moment. The lights were on. The stage was set. I didn't knock. I walked in the front door, the same door I'd walked out of 20 years ago. They were all there, in the living room, just as I knew they would be. Frank was pacing, his face a mask of purple rage. Rick and Dale were slumped on the couch, looking like cornered, angry animals. My father stood by the fireplace, looking small, a ghost in his own home. Frank saw me first. He stopped pacing and pointed a trembling finger at me. "You!" he roared, his voice cracking. "You sold us out, your own blood. For what?" I walked calmly to the center of the room, placing my briefcase on the coffee table. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. "I did exactly what you asked me to do," I said, my voice quiet, cutting through his anger. "I saved the factory." "You sacrificed us," Rick snarled, jumping to his feet. "No," I corrected him, my gaze sweeping over all three of them. "You sacrificed yourselves. I just arranged the funeral." I looked at Frank. "You told my father I was too soft to lead. You believed leadership was about being the loudest voice in the room. You mocked my ideas, my books, my entire approach to solving a problem." My eyes flickered to Rick. "You said the factory needed calluses, not paper cuts. Well, your calloused hands left fingerprints everywhere. You were so busy playing the tough guy, holding court in the break room, you never once stopped to wonder if anyone was watching. That's not grit, that's amateur hour." I let the insult hang in the air. "I gave you a strategy, a scalpel, and you used it like a club. You boasted, you bragged, you put your names on an illegal action, and handed corporate the evidence they needed on a silver platter. I didn't sell you out. You were simply out of your depth." Dale, who had been silent, finally spoke, his voice full of disbelief. "You planned this. From the beginning." "I planned for every contingency," I replied, "including your incompetence." I turned my attention back to my uncle. 20 years ago, in this very town, I presented a plan to make the line safer and more efficient. You laughed it off a table. Today, I presented a very similar plan to the CEO of Sterling Automotive. He saw the value in it. That plan is being implemented. The jobs are safe because of it, and my father will be the one to help oversee it. That was the final blow. Frank stared, speechless, his eyes darting between me and his brother. Rick took a step forward, his fists clenched. "I oughta." "You'll do nothing," a voice said. It was my father. He had stepped away from the fireplace, and for the first time in my life, he seemed to fill the room. He stood between me and my cousins. He looked at his brother, his face etched with a sorrowful resolve. "He's right, Frank. All of it. We were so proud of being tough, we forgot to be smart. Leo saved 600 jobs. He saved my job. What did you do? You got yourselves fired." The fight went out of them. replaced by a stunned, bitter silence. They looked at my father as if he were a stranger. In that moment, he was. He was no longer their silent, nodding accomplice. I picked up my briefcase. The company isn't contesting your unemployment claims. That was my final concession. A parting gift. I closed my briefcase with a soft, final click. You have your grit. I have my results. It seems we've discovered which one Sterling Automotive values more. The words hung in the suffocating silence. Frank didn't roar. He just deflated, sinking into his worn armchair like a man suddenly aged by 30 years. Rick and Dale stood frozen, their faces blank with the shock of a battle lost so completely they hadn't even realized they were fighting the wrong war. The hard men of the Vance clan were broken, not by a fist or a threat, but by a strategy they couldn't comprehend. I turned my back on them and walked toward the door. I didn't look back. The ghosts in that room no longer had any power over me. The crisp night air felt clean. As I reached my car, the front door creaked open behind me. Leo! I stopped but didn't turn around. It was my father. I heard his heavy work boots on the concrete walkway. He stopped a few feet behind me. That binder, he said, his voice raspy with emotion. The one from all those years ago. You still have it? No, I said, finally turning to face him. His face was illuminated by the streetlight, and I saw not a shadow, but a man wrestling with 2 decades of regret. I don't need it anymore. The ideas in it are what mattered. He nodded slowly, a profound understanding dawning in his eyes. He looked at my hands, soft and unmarked by factory work, then back to my face. We always thought you were too soft, he said, the words a quiet confession. We were wrong. You were never soft, son. You were sharp. And we were all just too damn blunt to see the edge. He finally saw me. Not the son who disappointed him, but the man I had become. I gave a single, slow nod. There was nothing else to say. I got into my car and pulled away from the curb, leaving the house and its history behind. In the rearview mirror, I saw my father standing on the sidewalk, watching me go. For the first time I could remember, he wasn't looking down at his feet. He was looking ahead. What would you do in my position? Be honest. Do you take the high road completely, or do you let them sweat just a little bit?